Hi, I'm Yasunori Takahashi from Kobe University, Japan. The title of my talk is The Grammatical Nature of Sino-Vietnamese Verb-object compounds. You can download my slide from the QR code here. In this study, I'd like to talk about grammatical borrowing from Chinese to Vietnamese. As for this issue, Alvis suggests that many of grammatical characteristics typical of varieties of Chinese are not part of Vietnamese grammar, and that the grammatical influence of Chinese is primarily lexical rather than structural. This idea has been generally supported by other previous studies which mainly focused on the development of Sino-Vietnamese grammatical words. I'd like to address again this issue in terms of Chinese grammar. In particular, I want to pay attention to Chinese verb-object compounds or 离合词 that have several unique grammatical characteristics and they have been borrowed into Vietnamese. So in this study, I'm going to investigate whether Sino-Vietnamese VO compounds retain the same grammatical characteristics as the original forms in Chinese. And in conclusion, I will show that their main characteristics have been lost in Vietnamese, which may support Alvis's generalization about grammatical borrowing from Chinese to Vietnamese. Okay, first of all, let me introduce grammatical characteristics of Chinese verb-object compounds. Lee and Thompson argue that Chinese VO compounds consist of two constituents having syntactic relations of a verb and its direct object, and that VO compounds are different from VO phrases in the following points. Firstly, VO compounds include more than one bound morphemes. In the slide, you can see 上市 come to market and 理发 have a haircut examples where the second constituents 是 and 发 are bound morphemes, which indicates that they are not phrases but compounds. However, Lee and Thompson also emphasize that the majority of VO compounds allow their constituents to be separated and other morphemes or words can be inserted between them. In 上市 and 理发 examples, their constituents can be separated by a perfective marker 了 like 上了市 or an experiential marker 过 like 理过发, even though their second morphemes are bound forms. This is a very important grammatical nature of Chinese VO compounds. In addition, Lee and Thompson point out that VO compounds have another important grammatical constraint on object words. That is, the majority of them do not take a direct object. Here, we will look at the case of 分类 meaning classify as example. It is noted that this word cannot be followed by a classified item as its object. Therefore, a phrase like 分类动物, that is, followed by a classified item 动物 is ungrammatical in Chinese. If we want to add the word animal as a classified item, we have to use a prepositional phrase preceding the VO compound. So we have to say 给动物分类, namely to animal classify. These are grammatical characteristics of Chinese verb-object compounds. Previous studies of Chinese syntax have discussed the status of VO compounds for many decades, and the consensus is summarized by Packard very nicely. He says, 离合词 are best viewed as a kind of word with one or two bound constituents, but a word whose constituents are subject to syntactic analysis as free element in certain limited context. This indicates that Chinese VO compounds have dual status as words and phrases. Okay, now I'd like to focus on Vietnamese. It is emphasized that a number of Chinese VO compounds have been borrowed into Vietnamese as Sino-Vietnamese words. Here, you can see three examples of Sino-Vietnamese words borrowed from VO compounds, namely Phan Loi, Ket On, and Pha Dien were borrowed from Phan Lei, Jie Hun, and Pha Dien respectively. In this study, I'd like to investigate whether Sino-Vietnamese VO compounds like these retain the same grammatical characteristics as their original forms in Chinese. For addressing this problem, I conducted two experiments with native speakers of Vietnamese. The first is a separation test, where I investigated whether Sino-Vietnamese VO compounds can be separated by some grammatical words. The second is an object test where I investigated whether they can be followed by an object word. Now I explain the methods of the experiments. Before conducting the experiments, I selected target words. Firstly, I collected 268 Chinese VO compounds from a Rihatsu dictionary written by Zhou. Then I confirmed 90 words out of them are listed as entries of the biggest Vietnamese-Japanese dictionary with Chinese characters, which is written by Kawamoto. After that, we show these 90 Sino-Vietnamese words to a female native speaker of Vietnamese living in Hanoi and asked her their familiarity. She answered that 47 words were familiar and commonly used for her, therefore I selected them as target words of my experiments. In the separation test, we investigated whether it is possible to separate the constituents of target words by inserting three grammatical words, namely the, like, and het, which mean fortunately, repeating, and be completely finished, respectively. They can be inserted between a verb and an object in normal verb phrases, as shown in the examples here. So we tried to insert them into the target words. The results are very simple. The speaker S1 answered, all target words cannot be separated by the grammatical words with one exception, that is, Pha Dien, to generate electricity. This word allows to be separated only by the, and she made a sentence like Kai Mai Nai Pha Duc Dien, meaning this machine can generate electricity. Here I emphasize again that this is only one exception, and we found that it is impossible to insert the grammatical words into any other target words. Therefore, we can think that Sino-Vietnamese VO compounds have a strong tendency to reject their separation, which indicates that the phrasal status found in Chinese VO compounds has been lost in Vietnamese. Next, let me explain the second experiment where I investigated whether each target word can take an object word behind it. I tried to insert various object words behind the target words, and the female native speaker S1 assessed their grammaticality. The results were relatively complicated and unstable, thus it was necessary to analyze additional data from another native speaker of Vietnamese. However, because of COVID-19 pandemic, I could only conduct a partial assessment test with a second native speaker S2. In the assessment test, S2 selected 32 words out of 47 original target words as familiar and commonly used for her. Therefore, we treated them as new target and she assessed whether they can take an object or not. Now I'd like to show the combined results of the second experiment. Based on the answers by the two native speakers, we can classify the target words into 5 groups. The first group is VO compounds which can take an object. This group includes 7 words, and in the slide you can see example phrases with an object word which were made by the native speakers. Here, it is important to emphasize that, in principle, Chinese VO compounds cannot take an object like these examples. So we can think that these Sino-Vietnamese words have different grammatical characteristics from their original forms in Chinese. The second group is the words where the two speakers answered differently about their possibility of taking an object. This group includes 7 words, and the first speaker S1 answered all of them can take an object, while the second speaker S2 did not accept that. I think it is necessary to add more data for determining their transitivity, but at least 3 words, that is dem danh, tcom, and tchik, have examples with an object in Vietnamese dictionaries as shown in the slide. For example, dem danh, call the roll can take a noun of sinh, student, as its object word. The third group is pham toi and thuente, which can take a verb phrase rather than an object word. Pham toi, commit a crime, can take a verb phrase representing various criminal actions. For example, pham toi buôn bán ma túy, to commit drug sales. Similarly, thuente can take a verb phrase representing what is declared. The fourth group is the words which cannot take an object. Instead, the related nouns can appear at the prepositional phrase following them. In the examples here, blue words represent prepositions and the related nouns follow them as their complements. I'd like to emphasize that this grammatical nature is in common with the original VO compounds in Chinese, as shown in the slide number 7. The final group is the words which cannot take an object, and we did not find other resolutions like a prepositional phrase. This group includes 11 members, and they are in common with the original Chinese VO compounds in their transitivity. Okay, now we summarize the results of the experiment too. This table shows the overall results about the possibility of taking an object. Here, I removed the second group where the two native speakers answered differently. The most important point here is that 7 words can take an object and 2 words can take a verb phrase, which indicates that they were reinterpreted as transitive verbs through lexical borrowing from Chinese to Vietnamese. On the other hand, a large number of them are in common with Chinese VO compounds in their transitivity. Finally, I'd like to summarize the overall result. The results of the experiment 1 show that Sino-Vietnamese words borrowed from Chinese VO compounds almost lost their phrasal status and in general cannot be separated by any other words. The separability of VO compounds is one of unique grammatical characteristics of Chinese, and the borrowed Sino-Vietnamese words have almost lost it. I think this fact fully supports Alvis's generalization about grammatical borrowing from Chinese to Vietnamese. That is, many characteristics typical of varieties of Chinese are not part of Vietnamese grammar, which can be applied to the borrowing of VO compounds. On the other hand, the transitivity of borrowed VO compounds is relatively complicated. In the second experiment, we found that, different from the original VO compounds in Chinese, some words allowed to take an object, which indicates that they have been reanalyzed as transitive verbs in Vietnamese. However, for now, it is difficult to predict which VO compounds were reanalyzed as transitive verbs in Vietnamese and what factors determine the transitivity of Sino-Vietnamese VO compounds. As for this issue, I want to introduce transitivity of the borrowed VO compounds in Japanese. Japanese also have borrowed a number of VO compounds from Chinese, and it is noted that their transitivity is basically in common with those of Sino-Vietnamese. For example, the borrowed item from fen leg to classify have become a transitive verb both in Japanese and Vietnamese. So in Japanese we can say 動物を分類する to classify animals where the accusative particle o clearly represents this borrowed item is a transitive verb. On the other hand, the borrowed item from Po-chan, go bankrupt, cannot take an object both in Japanese and Vietnamese. I guess the transitivity of the borrowed VO compounds may be determined by some semantic factors shared in Japanese and Vietnamese, so we are going to try to identify them in future study. These are references. Thank you.